It is overtime here again at Old Favorite Friday, discussing incredible classic beers and giving them the love and the respect that they so rightfully deserve. And this week we have another beer from Heavy Seas. This is a brewery that I featured several times on Old Favorite Friday, a brewery that I really enjoy their beers. And this was a beer, Blackbeard's Breakfast is the name of the beer. It's an Imperial porter with espresso beans and aged in bourbon barrels. This is a beer that I had, I believe, when it first came out. I had this and really loved it. And I identified it on the shelves maybe a year or so ago, and I thought, oh, that would be a good beer for Old Favorite Friday, but it was only 9 years old at the time. And I have this thing in my head where all the beers have to be at least 10 years old, even though I do make some exceptions here or there. But I marked it down, hopefully hoping that it would be released and come down here to Florida again this year, and lo and behold, it showed up on the shelves. This is a seasonal release. It's released and available usually from January to March every single year. So this is the tail end of its availability, but a lot of times these beers and specialty retailers will sit on the shelves, so you have a good opportunity if you can go to your local specialty craft beer retailer that they might still have some of these. And the other cool thing about this beer is at 10% for an Imperial Porter, aged in bourbon barrels. This is going to age really well. This is another one of those beers where even if you saw the version from last year, gobble that up because it's probably going to taste really good. And if you're the kind of person that likes to age beer or isn't getting into it for the first time, get yourself a 6-pack, take 2 of the bottles and put them down in the cellar, give it 6 months, a year and a half, and try it again and see if it changes and that kind of your palate enjoys that older flavor, that more complexity, or you like the beer when it's kind of younger and has more of that exuberant individual like adjuncts kind of flavor. But this beer in general is fantastic. We wouldn't be talking about it on Old Favorite Friday if it wasn't. It is what I would call elegant, and I would say that it is a grown-up beer in a lot of ways. And I mean that in the fact that you've got espresso beans and you've got bourbon barrels. And there is a temptation for most breweries to go over the top with both those flavors and make the beer nothing but those. And whether it is just bourbon or just coffee or both together. And it's kind of a juvenile way to look at beer, quite honestly. It's kind of a, what have you done for me lately kind of thing, in the fact that you want to impress people so much about this one flavor that you put into the beer, but at the end of the day, it has no nuance, it has no subtlety, and it's just kind of a one-trick pony. And people will quickly move on to the next thing that tastes just like the one thing that the beer is supposed to taste like. Whereas a beer like this, it has this subtle nuance of espresso. The coffee's there, the roast is there, even lending some like dark fruit flavor to the beer itself. But it doesn't dominate, right? The bourbon is there, but it's not like I just took a shot of bourbon and just poured it inside the beer. It adds the subtle smokiness, the subtle vanilla and caramel, but it lends itself and complements the espresso and complements the malts that built this beer in the first place. It takes time and energy to do that. It takes skill to do that. I was a home brewer, 20 years ago when I first got into craft beer. And it was really easy. People would ask, well, why is this beer so good? Why does it taste just like raspberries? It's like, well, I use like 100 pounds of raspberries for like this much beer. So yeah, it tasted like that. That's easy. That's a shortcut. Trying to do something that's balanced and nuanced and has more to it than just one flavor that you can just dominate, that's where the real skill of brewing comes in. And a brewery like this has that skill and has showed it for many years. The alcohol is hid extremely well in this for a 10% beer. It drinks really smooth. I'm not picking up any burn from that. It's another thing that shows the refinement of really good brewing. When you can have a 10% bourbon barrel beer that drinks this clean and this smooth, not only is it a better drinking experience for us, but it's also going to pair better with food. There's actually some really good things that I could pair with this that I'll tell you about in a second. But I would be remiss if I did not mention, I probably mention this maybe in every single Old Favorite Friday episode where I talk about Heavy Seas, Peg Leg Imperial Stout. I have not had my hands on that beer in a long time. I don't even know if it's still in production, but I'm talking about an Imperial Porter. Their Imperial Stout was one of the beers that turned me on to that brewery in the first place. One of the best Imperial Stouts I've ever had in my life, and also a beer I think rivaled any of the hype, hard to get Imperial Stouts from the 2000s and 2010s. And it was just about as high as quality as you could get. I could get it on a regular basis, and it put a lot of those beers to shame. So I'm just saying that because I always like to point that out because, first of all, that's the kind of thing Old Favorite Friday is meant for. But it just goes to show my love for this brewery and how good they can be and with everything they do. So kudos to you guys. If Peg Leg's still around or it's a seasonal, I got to find a way to get my hands on it because I mean, I got to do it for Old Favorite Friday. But I digress. What would I pair this Imperial Porter with espresso beans and aged in bourbon barrels? I want sweet barbecue with something like this, and there's a reason for that. So there's a smokiness here from the bourbon that's going to lend itself to barbecue and vice versa. And I like the espresso here. We see espresso rubs and barbecue all the time. I've worked at restaurants that they did espresso or coffee barbecue sauces. So you add that sweet barbecue sauce, not everyone's cup of tea, but a sweet barbecue sauce and something like a pork belly, burn ends kind of thing. And you add that coffee there, it balances that out, the sweetness with the roast. You have those flavors that complement so much with like the dark fruits that are inherent inside this beer. And I think it's just a really pleasant drinking experience, especially with a big, rich dish like that, to go with a 10% Imperial Porter that can match up to something like that. So that would be, there's a lot of things you can do with it, but that would be the first thing that comes to mind. And also, I usually don't mention desserts here because I feel like people think that beers are pigeonholed into being with desserts often, especially dark beers, Imperial Porters, Imperial Stouts. Everyone's always like chocolate cake, right? Chocolate ice cream, tiramisu. Yes, they go really well together, and I highly recommend you do this with a molten lava cake. You're going to be a happy person, but it's not just that. That's not the only thing that these beers are good for. They compare with appetizers. They compare with a wider range of food. But yes, that would work really well together because obviously it would. Espresso, bourbon, and chocolate cake are fantastic. And that beer is fantastic. Guys, thank you very much for joining me as always. I always appreciate your comments about these beers individually. I also would love to hear what you guys are drinking for Old Favorite Friday. It gives me ideas of beers that I can do. A lot of times I do get recommendations from people outside of South Florida, and they'll tell me all these great beers I need to be doing, and I have to say, unfortunately, I have no accessibility to that beer, and I've never had it. I'd love to, but can't do it. So if you make a recommendation for a beer, that might be the reason why we don't do it on Old Favorite Friday. But please poke around the YouTube channel, like and subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Cheers.